She arrived with nothing but a worn bag and a hunger she was too proud to name. They called her a threat, a replacement, a gold digger chasing a dead woman's life. But no one asked why an 18-year-old girl would travel 40 miles alone through frontier wilderness to scrub strangers' floors and sleep in a drafty corner near the kitchen. No one asked what she'd left behind or what had been taken from her. This is the story of Lenora Vale, a girl who was given nothing, expected even less, and somehow became the person an entire broken family couldn't survive without. Like this video. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Lenora Vale left home, her mother didn't say goodbye. Not because she didn't love her. She loved her the way hungry people love bread, desperately, quietly, with a shame underneath that came from knowing she was about to let it go. Lenora stood in the doorway of their two-room cabin with her bag already on her shoulder, watching her mother's back at the stove that had nothing on it, the pot that had nothing in it. Her two younger brothers asleep on the same pallet they shared because there was only one blanket thick enough to matter. "Mama," Lenora said. "Go on," her mother said. She didn't turn around. That was the whole conversation. Lenora walked out into the gray October morning and didn't look back, because she knew if she did, she would see her mother's shoulders shaking, and then she wouldn't be able to leave, and if she didn't leave, they were all going to starve before the first real frost hit. It wasn't a dramatic decision. Dramatic decisions happen when people have choices. Lenora Vale didn't have choices. She had a name on a piece of paper, a ranch that needed a hired girl, and 41 miles of open territory between her and a man named Gideon Blackthorne, who had apparently agreed, through a letter exchange she hadn't even been part of, to take her on. Her neighbor, Mrs. Aldrich, had arranged it. Mrs. Aldrich knew a woman who attended the same church as someone in Harrow County, and that someone had mentioned that the widowed Blackthorne rancher was struggling to keep the household together with 3 children and 1,000 acres and no woman's hand anywhere near the place. It wasn't charity, Mrs. Aldrich had been careful to say. It was employment, room and board, modest wages, honest work. Nothing owed, nothing assumed. Lenora had said yes before Mrs. Aldrich finished the sentence. The wagon that carried her most of the way belonged to a feed merchant named Crowell, who didn't talk much and smelled like sawdust and tobacco. He dropped her at the crossroads outside Harrow with a nod and a, "You'll see the ridge from here. Follow the fence line." And then he was gone, and Lenora stood alone with her bag and the wind pushing at her from all directions. She followed the fence line. It took her an hour and a half on foot, and by the time she saw the ranch, she'd sweated through the back of her dress despite the cold. The main house was bigger than she expected. 2 full stories of weathered timber, a wraparound porch, a stone chimney that had been repaired at least twice. There was a barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop that had seen better years. The whole property had the look of a place that had once been tended with real pride and now was just being maintained, kept alive, not loved. She stood at the gate for a moment. A curtain moved in one of the upstairs windows. A child's face appeared, stared down at her, and vanished. Lenora squared her shoulders, walked up the path, and knocked on the door. Gideon Blackthorne opened it. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. The letter had said he was a widower with 3 children, had been running Blackthorne Ranch for 11 years. She'd imagined someone older, maybe softer. Instead, she got a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the same wood as the house. Somewhere around 35, broad through the shoulders, dark hair that needed cutting, jaw that needed shaving. He had eyes the color of creek water in November, not quite gray, not quite green, and about as warm as either. He looked at her. Then he looked behind her, as though expecting someone else. "You're the hired girl," he said. "Lenora Vale." She offered her hand. He shook it, briefly, like he wasn't sure the gesture applied here, and stepped back to let her in. "You're younger than I thought. Mrs. Aldrich's letter mentioned my age." "She said 18. I thought she meant—" He stopped. "Never mind." "You thought she exaggerated down." He looked at her again, more carefully this time. "Something like that." The entryway of the house was clean. That was the first thing she noticed. It was cold and it was quiet, and it had that particular stillness of a place that is cleaned out of habit rather than out of any joy in the cleanliness. But it wasn't dirty. She'd half expected chaos, 3 motherless children and a working rancher. She'd braced herself. But the boots were lined up by the door, the coats were on the hooks. There was a rag rug on the floor that someone shook out regularly. The house didn't need saving from disorder. It needed saving from something quieter than that. "The children are upstairs," Gideon said. He moved toward a narrow hallway. "I'll show you the kitchen, the house rules, where you'll sleep. Then I'll introduce you." "All right," he paused. "You eat before you came?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She met his eyes. "No." He nodded, like she'd confirmed something he'd already figured out, and led her to the kitchen. The kitchen was the best room in the house. That was immediately apparent. The rest of the house had the careful, brittle quality of a place where people were afraid to take up too much space. But the kitchen was large and warm, and there were herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and a big pine table with 8 years' worth of scratches in it. Someone had loved this room once. You could still feel it, the way you can still feel warmth from a fire that's been let go cold. Gideon set a plate of leftover biscuits on the table and didn't say anything about it. Just poured 2 mugs of coffee and sat down and started telling her the house rules. There were 6 of them. They were reasonable. She ate 1 biscuit slowly and listened. No entering his study without being asked. Breakfast at 6, supper at 5:30. Sundays were half days. She could have the afternoon. The children's schoolwork was her responsibility on weekday mornings. She was not, under any circumstances, to let anyone into the house or onto the property without his knowing. And he said this last one slower, not looking at her. She was not to rearrange, remove, or otherwise interfere with anything in the upstairs bedroom at the end of the hall. She didn't ask. She could guess. "Is there anything else?" he said. "The wages." He told her the number. It was fair. "What about the children?" she said. "Their names, their ages, what I should know." He wrapped both hands around his mug. She had the feeling this was the part of the conversation he'd been least looking forward to. "Maeve is 13. She's the oldest. He stopped, started over. "She's capable. She runs things when I'm out with the cattle. She'll probably resent you." "All right." "Eli is 9. He's sensitive. He has trouble sleeping. He's not—" Another pause. "He's not been well lately. Nothing serious. He just needs patience." "And the youngest?" "Nora. She's 6. His voice did something complicated on the name. Not quite breaking, but bending. "She doesn't talk much anymore." Lenora looked at him. He was staring at his coffee. "She used to," he said. Before her mother died." "Yes." "How long ago?" 14 months. She nodded. She wrapped her hands around her own mug and let the silence sit for a moment because she could tell he needed it. "What was her name?" Lenora said. He looked up. Nobody had asked him that in a while, she could tell. "Clara. Clara Blackthorne." "Yes." "She loved this kitchen." He stared at her. "How did you—" "The herbs, the table, the way the window over the sink is positioned to catch morning light." Lenora looked around the room. "Somebody put real thought into this room. You don't do that for practical reasons." Gideon Blackthorne was quiet for a long time. "She did," he finally said. "Yes." Meeting the children did not go the way Lenora had hoped, though she hadn't hoped for much. Gideon called them down from upstairs, and they came in a line, oldest to youngest, careful as soldiers. Maeve first, tall for 13, dark like her father, with eyes that swept over Lenora in about 2 seconds and made a judgment that wasn't favorable. Eli behind her, slight and pale, with a fever flush in his cheeks that Lenora noticed and filed away. And last, pressed against Maeve's side, Nora. Small and brown-haired and serious in the way that very young children become serious when they have seen something they shouldn't have had to see. "Children," Gideon said, "this is Miss Vale. She's going to help around the house." Silence. "Hello," Lenora said. Eli looked at his shoes. Nora stared at a point somewhere around Lenora's collarbone. Maeve said, "How old are you?" 18. "You're not much older than me." "No, not much." Maeve's eyes narrowed. "You ever worked on a ranch before?" "No, I grew up on a farm." "It's different." "I imagine it is. You'll have to show me what I don't know." That was the wrong thing to say, or the right thing, depending on how you looked at it. Maeve clearly hadn't expected to be asked for anything, and it threw her off her planned dismissal just enough to leave her silent for a moment. "Dinner's at 5:30, Maeve said finally. "If you're late, you don't eat." "Maeve." Gideon's voice was quiet. "It's a rule," Maeve said, not looking at him. "It's fine," Lenora said. "I won't be late." She wasn't late. She was early, in fact, had already started on the pot of stew from the remaining vegetables she'd found in the cellar before 5 o'clock, had set the table, had figured out where the plates lived and where the firewood was stacked and how much the kitchen stove needed to be coaxed before it behaved. By the time the family sat down, there was hot food on the table and the kitchen smelled like something other than cold air. Maeve sat down and looked at the stew and didn't say anything. Eli said, "It smells good." Nora reached for her spoon and stopped, looking at Lenora as though asking permission. Lenora nodded slightly, and the little girl picked up her spoon. Gideon said grace, short, perfunctory. The words of a man who says them because he's supposed to, not because he believes they'll be heard. Then they ate. It was not a comfortable meal. The silence was the kind that has texture, full of things nobody was saying, pressing in from all sides. But nobody was rude, and the food was eaten, and when Eli reached for a second bowl, Lenora ladled it out without comment, which made him look at her with something that wasn't quite gratitude but was in the neighborhood. Afterward, Maeve cleared the table, without being asked, which surprised Lenora. "You can do the washing up," Maeve said. "That's normally my job, but since you're here, I'll do it," Lenora said. "You should have your evenings." Maeve looked at her. Something shifted in her face, too quick to read. Then she turned and went upstairs. Lenora's room was small. This was being generous. It was a room in the way that a closet is a room. It had 4 walls and a door and a window no bigger than a book, and the bed was a narrow iron thing with a mattress that had been restuffed at some point with something that hadn't quite worked. There was a hook on the wall for her coat. There was nothing else. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about her brothers sleeping back home on their shared pallet. Thought about her mother at the empty stove. She unpacked her bag. It didn't take long. 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush, a small tin mirror, the book she'd been carrying for 3 years without finishing. She tucked the bag under the bed and lay down in her dress because she was too cold to undress, and stared at the ceiling until she was sure the house was quiet. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, and started making a list of what needed doing. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of her life, and she'd had a hard life, so that was saying something. The ranch work was brutal in a way that was different from farm work. Wider, rawer, more constant. There was always something that needed doing, always something that had been put off too long, always a corner of the property that was fighting back against the human attempt to keep it ordered. Lenora threw herself at it the way she'd thrown herself at everything since she was old enough to lift something, without complaint, without asking for credit, with the quiet understanding that the work was the work and it needed doing, and she was the one there to do it. She was up before the household every morning. She had the coffee made and the fire going before Gideon came downstairs, and she could see it registered, that small flicker of surprise each morning when he walked into a kitchen that was already warm. He didn't thank her for it. She didn't expect him to. She learned Eli's fever was not recent. He'd been running low-grade temperatures on and off for months. Something Gideon mentioned almost accidentally one evening. The way people mention things they've been carrying alone for too long. "Has he seen a doctor?" she said. "Dr. Henley comes through from Clearfield about once a month." "When's he due?" 3 weeks, maybe." "That's a long time." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I know that." She didn't push, but she started making Eli drink more broth with his meals, and she got the kitchen warmer in the mornings before the boy came down, and she took note of which days he seemed worse and which seemed better. She learned that Nora would sometimes appear at the kitchen door in the middle of the night, standing there in her nightgown, not crying, not calling for anyone, just standing. The first time it happened, Lenora almost walked into her coming back from the outhouse at 2 in the morning. She had a half-second of pure fright and then looked down at the little girl standing in the cold. "Can't sleep?" Lenora said, very quietly. Nora shook her head. "Come on then." She'd brought the child into the kitchen and put the kettle on for warm milk and sat with her at the table in the dark, not talking, not demanding anything, just present. Nora drank her milk and then allowed herself to be led back upstairs. And when Lenora tucked the blanket around her, the little girl grabbed her wrist with both hands and held it for about 30 seconds. Then she let go, turned over, and went to sleep. It happened 4 more times over the following weeks. It became a quiet routine. The middle of the night kitchen, the warm milk, the silence between them that was starting to feel less like silence and more like a kind of conversation. Maeve remained hostile. Not openly. Not in any way Lenora could directly address. It was subtler than that. The way Maeve would rearrange something Lenora had put away. The way she would answer questions with the shortest possible words. The way she watched from doorways like a person waiting for something to go wrong. About 10 days in, Lenora came down from hanging laundry to find that her carefully organized kitchen shelves had been reorganized back to the original order, which was a worse system by any practical measure. Pots grouped by size rather than use. Spices alphabetical, but separated from the cooking side of the kitchen by 6 feet of counter. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the shelves. Then she put them back the way she had them. 20 minutes later, Maeve appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I moved those back," Maeve said. "I noticed." Lenora didn't look up from the dough she was working. "That's where they've always been." "I know." Lenora pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. "The way I have it makes more sense for cooking, though. You keep the things you reach for most where you can reach them fastest. This is my mother's kitchen." Lenora stopped. She turned around and looked at Maeve directly. The girl's chin was up, jaw set, eyes bright with something that had nothing to do with kitchen shelves. "Yes," Lenora said. "It is." Silence. "I'm not trying to change that," Lenora said. "I'm just trying to make the work go faster so that I can do more of it, and you can do less of it. That's all." Maeve stared at her. "Why would you care if I do less work?" "Because you're 13 years old, and you've been running this house for over a year, and that's too much for one person, especially a person your age." Something moved across Maeve's face. Too fast, too complicated for Lenora to name. "I don't need your pity," Maeve said. "It's not pity. Pity is when you feel sorry for someone. I'm not sorry for you. I think you're remarkable." Lenora held her gaze. "But remarkable people still get tired, Maeve, and they still need help." Maeve left without responding, but the shelves stayed the way Lenora had put them. It was the quilt that changed things, or started to change them. These things rarely happen all at once. Lenora found it in the linen chest at the foot of the upstairs hallway, not in the closed-off bedroom at the end of the hall, so she didn't feel she was crossing any line by opening the chest for extra blankets. It was on top, a half-finished quilt, a wedding ring pattern in blues and creams, and a faded rose color that had probably been brighter once. The stitching was careful, practiced. It had been put away mid-square. There was still a needle threaded into the fabric, waiting. She left it in the chest and didn't touch it. But she mentioned it to Gideon that evening, carefully. The way you approach a thing you're not sure is safe. She waited until after supper, when the children were upstairs and he was at the table with his account books. "There's a quilt in the linen chest," she said. He didn't look up. "I know." "It looks unfinished." "It is." She waited. "Clara was making it for Nora," he said. His voice was entirely flat, the voice of someone who has practiced saying a thing until the feeling won't come through anymore. "She never—" He turned a page in the account book. "She ran out of time." Lenora said nothing for a moment. Then, "Does anyone know how to finish it?" "No one in this house is going to finish that quilt, Miss Vale." It wasn't angry. It was just firm and final and done. He turned another page. She went to bed. But 2 days later, she was sitting at the kitchen table in the afternoon, mending one of Eli's shirts, when Maeve came in and sat down across from her. Without a word, without any lead-up, Maeve set a piece of blue calico fabric on the table. "Mama had a basket of scraps she was saving for it," Maeve said. She wasn't looking at Lenora. "I know where the pattern is." Lenora looked at the fabric, then at Maeve. "You want to finish it?" "I want Nora to have it." A pause. "She doesn't remember things the way I do. She was 4 when—" Maeve stopped. "She's going to grow up and not remember things right. I want her to have something she can hold." The girl was still not looking at her. Her hands were flat on the table, pressing down, like she needed to feel something solid. "Okay," Lenora said. "Get the basket and the pattern. I can sew. You probably can too." Mama taught me. Then we'll do it together. They worked on the quilt in the evenings, when the supper things were done and the kitchen was warm. At first it was just Maeve and Lenora, quiet at the table, passing fabric back and forth. Then one night Eli wandered in and watched for a while and eventually sat down and asked if he could do something, and Lenora showed him how to sort the squares by color, which wasn't sewing but made him feel useful, which was the point. Nora came in last, on the fourth night. She stood in the doorway for a long time. "That's Mama's quilt," she said, the first full sentence Lenora had heard from her. "Yes," Maeve said. "We're finishing it. For you." Nora walked to the table slowly, as though the quilt might disappear if she moved too fast. She reached out and touched one of the cream-colored squares, ran her finger along Clara's stitching. The old part, the part that had been done before. "Is that okay?" Lenora said. "Finishing it?" Nora looked at her, 6 years old, with her mother's brown hair and her father's watchful gray-green eyes. "Yes," she said, very seriously. "Mama would have wanted it done, but—" Gideon found out about the quilt on the 6th night. He came in from the barn late, later than usual, and stopped in the kitchen doorway at the sight of all 3 of his children around the table, bent over fabric and thread, talking to each other in low voices while Lenora pressed seams flat with the back of a spoon. He stood there long enough that Lenora noticed. She looked up. He was watching Maeve thread a needle, watching the careful way Eli held a stack of squares so they wouldn't slip, watching Nora trace her mother's old stitching with one small finger. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do yet. She looked back down at her work to give him the privacy of it. After a moment, he walked in and hung his hat on the hook and poured himself coffee and sat down at the far end of the table. He didn't say anything. He just sat there with his coffee and his account book and let his children fill the kitchen with the quiet sounds of something being put back together, one piece at a time. Harrow County had opinions about Lenora Vale. She knew this before she'd been there a week. She knew it from the way the feed store man looked at her when she rode in with Gideon for supplies. That appraising, skeptical look that ran from her face to her shoes and back with a particular kind of arithmetic. She knew it from the woman at the dry goods counter who smiled with her mouth only and asked with exaggerated sweetness where she'd come from and what her family's situation was. She knew it from the group of women outside the church on the single Sunday she attended with the family, their conversation stopping as she approached, their eyes doing their own version of that arithmetic. She didn't know, until the 4th week, about Vera Stanton. Vera Stanton was Clara Blackthorne's older sister. She was a compact, fair-haired woman in her late 30s who had lived in Harrow County her entire life, was married to the man who owned the town's only mill, and possessed the particular social power that comes from being both well-liked and righteous. She had, by all accounts, adored her younger sister and been devastated by Clara's death. She had also, since that death, made it something of a personal mission to look after Clara's children, not in the sense of taking them in, which would have required actual daily sacrifice, but in the sense of watching, monitoring, reporting concerns. The first time Vera Stanton came to Blackthorne Ranch, Lenora was in the yard with Nora. They were doing nothing improper. Lenora was hanging laundry and Nora had attached herself to the process, carrying each clothespin as a formal delivery, one at a time, with great seriousness. It was possibly the most peaceful moment of Lenora's month. The buggy came up the fence line and stopped, and Vera Stanton stepped down in her good visiting dress and looked at the scene with an expression that was not peaceful at all. "You must be the hired girl," she said. Lenora wiped her hands on her apron. "Lenora Vale, you're Mrs. Stanton." Vera's eyes went to Nora, who had pressed herself against Lenora's skirt and was peering around it. A complicated thing moved across Vera's face. "Nora, sweetheart," Vera said, bending slightly. "Come give your aunt a hug." Nora didn't move. Vera's expression tightened. She straightened up and looked at Lenora as though that was Lenora's fault. "Is Gideon in the house?" "He's in the north pasture. I can send one of the ranch hands to—" "It's all right," Vera said in a tone that made clear it wasn't. "Tell him I stopped by." She looked one more time at Nora, still pressed against Lenora's side. "I'll be back." She climbed back into the buggy and drove off, and Lenora stood in the yard watching her go and understanding, with a very clear and quiet clarity, that her situation had just become more complicated. "She doesn't like me," Lenora said to Gideon that evening. He was at the kitchen table again. He seemed to live at that table in the evenings, between the account books and the quiet. She'd started to understand it wasn't the books that kept him there. It was the kitchen, the warmth of it. "She doesn't know you," he said. "She came to a conclusion anyway." He looked up. "That's Vera. She loves those children. She just—" He rubbed the back of his neck. "She's been watching out for them since Clara died. She's not—" He seemed to struggle with the next word and settle on, "She's protective. She thinks I'm a threat." He was quiet. "Do you?" Lenora said. He met her eyes. It was a direct question, and she'd asked it directly, and something about that seemed to catch him off guard, because he took a moment before he answered. "No," he said. "I think you're doing a job that needed doing, and doing it well." It wasn't warm. It wasn't reassuring in any particular way. But it was honest, and she'd learned in 4 weeks that Gideon Blackthorn's honesty was the thing she could count on most reliably, so she took it for what it was worth. "Thank you," she said. "Go to bed, Miss Vale. It's late." But the rumors had started. She couldn't see them, but she could feel them the way you can feel weather coming. A change in pressure, a particular quality to the air. The way Gideon came home from town one evening slightly too quiet. The way the miller's boy delivered a small package and refused to look at her. The way Mrs. Aldrich's monthly letter arrived with an added paragraph at the bottom, careful and apologetic in its phrasing, mentioning that she'd heard some chatter and hoped Lenora was conducting herself with proper decorum, as though she'd had a single moment since arriving that wasn't consumed entirely by scrubbing, cooking, mending, shoveling, carrying, and quietly making sure 3 grieving children had hot food and someone to notice when they were cold. She wrote back to Mrs. Aldrich, "I am well. The family is well. I hope you and yours are the same." She didn't address the chatter. What was there to say? The people who wanted to see something improper would see it regardless. The people who decided she was after something would find proof of it in her ordinariness the same way they'd find it in anything else. She'd grown up poor in a county where poor people were suspected of wanting things that didn't belong to them. This was not a new experience. It was just a larger stage. The evening the quilt section was completed. They'd been at it for almost 2 weeks, evenings only, and had finished about half of what remained. Maeve did something that Lenora hadn't expected. She sat back in her chair after they'd folded the work away, and she looked at Lenora, and she said, "Why are you here?" It wasn't hostile. For the first time, it wasn't hostile at all. It was just a question. "I needed work," Lenora said. "My family needed me to find it." "Your family? Brothers? Sisters?" "2 brothers, younger." "Your father?" Lenora was quiet for a moment. "Gone." "Dead?" "Gone," she said again. Maeve seemed to understand that was all there was to that answer. "So you came here?" "Yes." Maeve traced a seam in the quilt fabric with her fingertip. "Do you miss home?" Lenora thought about her mother's back at the empty stove, thought about the pallet her brothers shared. "I miss my brothers," she said. "I don't miss being hungry." Maeve looked up at her. "Were you really hungry?" "Yes." "We're not rich," Maeve said with 13-year-old frankness. "My papa works very hard, but this ranch barely—" She stopped, as though realizing she was saying something she maybe shouldn't. "I know." Lenora kept her voice level. "This isn't about rich. This is about having enough. And your family has enough. Mine didn't." Maeve was quiet for a long moment. "Eli likes you," she said finally. The way she said it was not a compliment so much as a report, a fact she was filing somewhat against her will. "I like him," Lenora said. "Nora, too. She told me last night." Another pause. "She hasn't talked much and she's been very quiet since Mama, but she talks about you." Lenora didn't say anything. "I'm not saying—" Maeve pressed her lips together. "I'm not saying I've decided anything about you. I'm just saying that." "I understand," Lenora said. She did. The nights were getting colder. November was pressing in from the north, the sky darkening earlier, the wind off the ridge picking up a bite that promised worse things to come. Gideon had said the word blizzard once, in passing, talking to one of his ranch hands about the state of the wood supply, The need to get the livestock squared away in the barns before the first real storm hit. He'd said it the way people say words for things they know are coming, matter of fact, almost bored, the way people get bored with things that scare them. Lenora had grown up in a place that had hard winters, but the particular quality of winter in this part of the country was something she was still learning, something vast about it, something that made the house feel small. She made sure every spare blanket in the house was clean. She made sure the wood box was always topped. She started making bigger pots of soup, things that could reheat, because she had a sense, maybe wrong, maybe not, that having food already made was going to matter before too long. Eli's fever woke her the night of November 7th. She didn't hear him. The walls were too thick for that. But she woke at 3 in the morning with the sharp, inexplicable certainty that something was wrong, and she lay still for about 30 seconds arguing with herself, and then she got up. She found him at the top of the stairs, sitting on the top step in his nightshirt, shivering so hard his teeth were clicking together. Eli. She knelt down next to him, put her hand to his forehead. He was burning. "How long have you felt this way?" she said, keeping her voice level. "Since," he swallowed, "since before supper. I didn't want to say anything." "Why not?" He looked at her with 9-year-old logic. "Because Papa worries." She got him back to bed, got every spare blanket in the house onto him, and went to get Gideon. She stood outside his bedroom door in the dark hallway and knocked, firmly, 3 times. He opened it faster than she expected. He might not have been sleeping either. "It's Eli," she said. "His fever is high. It's not like the other times." She could see him process that in real time. The sleep leaving his face, replaced by something harder and more awake. "How high?" "I don't know exactly. High enough that I woke you." He was already reaching for his boots. Outside, the wind had picked up from the north. Eli's fever broke on the 3rd day. Not cleanly. There was nothing clean about it. It came down the way a bad fever does, in stages, with setbacks between each one that made every small improvement feel like it might be the last. He'd sweat through his sheets, and Lenora would change them. He'd sleep 2 hours, and then wake shaking, and she'd be there. Gideon sat with him through most of the first night, and Lenora took the second, and by the 3rd morning, when Eli opened his eyes and asked in a hoarse, bewildered voice whether he'd missed breakfast, Gideon let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 72 hours. "You missed several," Lenora said from the doorway. "I'll make you something now." "Can I have eggs?" Eli said. "You can have whatever you want." She went downstairs and made him eggs and toast and warm broth on the side, and when she brought it up, he ate most of it, which she took as the best possible sign. Gideon was still in the chair next to the bed, still in the same clothes he'd been wearing since the fever started, with the particular hollowed-out look of a man who has been frightened for a long time and is only just beginning to believe the frightening thing is over. "You should sleep," Lenora said, taking the tray. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You look like something the barn cat dragged in." He looked at her, and for the first time in 3 days, something almost like a real expression crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Gideon Blackthorne didn't quite smile, she was learning, but something in that direction. "Barn cat," he said. "Go to bed, Mr. Blackthorne." He went. Lenora stayed with Eli the rest of the morning, mending in the chair by his bed while he drifted in and out of sleep. At some point, Nora crept in and climbed onto the foot of the bed, careful not to disturb him, and curled up there like a cat herself. Maeve appeared in the doorway around noon, looked at the scene, and seemed to make a decision about something. She pulled the small wooden chair from Eli's desk and sat down without a word, and picked up a book from the nightstand and started reading aloud to him, just quietly enough that it might have been for herself. Eli's eyes opened at the sound of her voice, and he lay there listening, and Lenora looked at the 3 of them and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with sadness. She looked back at her mending and kept her face even. The fever left its mark on Eli. It always did, on children that age. He was thinner after, tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix in a day or 2. But he was up by the end of the week, moving slower than usual, still wrapped in 2 sweaters, even indoors. And he had developed the habit of appearing at Lenora's elbow in the kitchen the way Nora had appeared at her skirt, not asking for anything, just being in the same room. She found him there on a Thursday afternoon when she was making bread, standing at the edge of the counter, watching her hands work the dough. "Can I do that?" he said. It's harder than it looks. I know. I've watched Maeve do it. He paused. She never let me try. Lenora stepped aside and let him at the dough. He was tentative at first, pressing with his palms the way he'd seen her do it, and the dough pushed back like dough does, indifferent and resistant, and he almost quit after 30 seconds. Press from your shoulders, not your wrists, Lenora said. Use your weight. He tried again. It went better. They worked side by side for a while, and she let him do more than he was technically capable of without interfering too much. Because the point wasn't the bread. Miss Vale, he said. Were you scared? When I was sick? She was quiet for a moment, because she'd learned with Eli that he could tell when adults were managing him, and he didn't like it. Yes, she said. He seemed satisfied with that. Papa was too. I could tell even when I was mostly asleep. He sat with you 2 nights straight. Eli processed this silently, kneading the dough with his bony 9-year-old shoulders. He doesn't always know how to say things, he said finally, with a fairness that sounded like something he'd been working out for a long time. He loves us, though. He just has trouble with the words. I know, Lenora said. Some people are like that. Are you? She thought about her mother at the stove, the goodbye that wasn't a goodbye. My family is, she said, so maybe I understand it a little. Eli looked up at her. Do you miss your family? Yes. Do you think you'll go back when we... He stopped. When we don't need you anymore was what he'd been about to say, and even at 9 he'd caught himself on it. Later, he finished. Lenora punched the dough gently, turned it, pressed again. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't think that far ahead. I just think about what needs doing today. He seemed to find that a reasonable answer, and went back to his kneading with the serious concentration of someone doing something important, which as far as Lenora was concerned, he was. The bread came out a little uneven. She didn't mention it, and neither did he, and when Gideon ate a slice at supper and said it was good, Eli sat up half an inch straighter in his chair. It was the kind of small moment that builds things, piece by piece, the way the quilt was being built. Not in great gestures, but in squares, in stitches, in bread that was a little lopsided and didn't need to be perfect to matter. The quilt itself had become the center of the household's evenings in a way that seemed to have happened without anyone deciding it would. The evenings that had once been the loneliest part of the day, the stretch between supper and sleep where the absence of Clara was most palpable when the house was quiet enough to hear it, had slowly reorganized themselves around the kitchen table and the growing panel of blue and cream fabric. Maeve had taken ownership of the more intricate stitching. Eli kept the squares sorted and counted. Nora sat close and handed things and sometimes picked up a needle herself and made small, imperfect stitches along seam lines that nobody corrected. One evening, Gideon sat down at the table with the rest of them. He didn't sew. He brought his account book, like he always did. But the account book stayed closed, and after a while he reached out and turned one of the completed squares over in his hands, looking at the stitching on the back. Some of it Clara's, some of it Maeve's, some of it Lenora's. He set it down without saying anything, but he stayed at the table until all 3 children went to bed, and that was something. The quilt was also the first thing Vera Stanton saw on her second visit. She arrived on a Tuesday when Gideon was out, which Lenora didn't think was accidental. Maeve let her in. The girl had complicated feelings about her aunt, visible even from a distance. Something between affection and wariness. The particular mix of a child who loves someone but doesn't quite trust their motives. Vera came into the kitchen and stopped at the sight of the quilt spread out on the table, half of it finished now, the pattern complete enough to be recognizable. "What is that?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Mama's quilt," Maeve said. "We're finishing it for Nora." Vera's face did something complicated that she controlled quickly. She looked from the quilt to Maeve to Lenora, who was at the stove and had not turned around. "Whose idea was this?" "Mine," Maeve said. "Miss Vale is helping." A pause. "I see." Lenora turned around then. She met Vera's eyes straight on and kept her expression neutral. Vera's eyes moved over her the way they had on the first visit, that arithmetic, and then went back to the quilt. "Clara would not have wanted a stranger's hands on this," Vera said. The kitchen went very quiet. Maeve straightened up. "Aunt Vera." Her voice was 13 years old and entirely certain. Mama would have wanted it finished. She made it for Nora, and Miss Vale has been... She paused, and Lenora could hear her choosing the word carefully. She's been kind to us. Mama would have noticed that. Vera looked at her niece for a long moment. Your mother, she said finally, was a better judge of character than most. The word most did some work in that sentence that everybody in the room noticed but nobody addressed. I hope you're right about this one. She stayed for an hour. She drank tea and talked to Maeve about her schoolwork and held Nora on her lap and smoothed her hair. And the love for the children was real. Lenora could see it was real. That made Vera harder to dismiss, and harder to be angry at, and harder to know what to do with. After she left, Maeve came to stand beside Lenora at the sink. She means well, Maeve said. I know she does. She loved Mama very much. They were close in the way sisters are. Lenora washed the teacups carefully. Do you think she'll cause trouble? Maeve was quiet for a moment. I think she already is, she said. In town. I heard some of the girls at school have been saying things. About you. About Papa. She stopped. About what people think is going on here. Lenora kept her hands in the wash water. What kind of things? That you're too young. That you want... Maeve made a gesture with her hand, impatient and uncomfortable. That you're not really just a hired girl. The water was cooling. Lenora kept washing. And what do you think? She said. I think... Maeve pressed her mouth together. I think people see what they want to see, and they're going to see it regardless. But I also think you should know it's being said. Because it might make things harder. For Papa. For the ranch. A pause. For you. Lenora set the last cup in the rack and dried her hands and looked at Maeve. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Maeve nodded once, in the same way her father nodded. Decisive, brief, moving on. The gossip was already worse than Lenora had thought. She understood this gradually, through accumulation of small evidence. The way the women at the dry goods store stopped their conversation when she came in. The way the feed merchant's wife asked how things were out at the Blackthorn place, with the particular brightness of someone who had already formed an opinion about the answer. The way the Reverend's wife had approached Gideon after the last Sunday service and spoken to him in a low, earnest voice that Lenora was not meant to hear, but caught pieces of anyway. Something about the children, something about appearances, something about a decision made too quickly. Gideon hadn't told her about that conversation, but she'd seen his face on the ride home, and she understood that something had been said to him that landed, and that he was going to carry it alone, because that was what he did with everything. It was 2 nights after Vera's visit, when the children were all asleep, that Lenora finally said it directly. You should tell me what's being said. Gideon looked up from his account book. Nothing that concerns you. It concerns me directly. It's about me. His jaw tightened. He looked back at the book. Gideon. She'd been calling him by his given name for about a week now. He hadn't objected, and she'd taken the silence as permission. He set down his pen, looked at her. Vera has spoken to some people on the church council. There's concern that the situation here isn't appropriate, that having someone your age in the house, that it looks bad. Yes. And what do they want you to do about it? They haven't said that directly. They've just expressed concern. He said the last 2 words like they tasted of something unpleasant. Concern for the children. They think you're putting the children at risk by having me here. They think that. He picked his pen up again. What they actually think is that their version of how things should look is more important than whether the children have food and warmth and someone to... He stopped. I shouldn't say that. Lenora looked at him. In 5 weeks, she'd never heard him come that close to saying what he actually thought about another person. It surprised her. I'm sorry, she said, that you're dealing with this because of me. You haven't done anything wrong. His voice was flat and certain, like it was a piece of arithmetic. You've done nothing but good in this house. Anyone willing to look with their eyes instead of their assumptions would see that. It wasn't sentimental. He said it the way he said everything, blunt and without decoration, like a man used to saying exact things, which somehow made it mean more than a longer speech would have. She looked at her hands on the table. I've been thinking, she said carefully, That if my being here is making things harder for you, for the children, then maybe it would be better if I... No, he cut her off cleanly, not harshly, just with finality. She looked up. The children are doing better than they've done in a year, he said. Eli's healing. Nora's talking. Maeve... He paused. Maeve laughed yesterday. I haven't heard that in 14 months. He picked up his pen. No one from town is going to sit at my table and tell me that's wrong. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down. Okay, she said. She went to bed. She lay in her narrow room in the dark and listened to the wind against the small window and thought about Vera Stanton's face above the quilt. Thought about what Maeve had said. About people seeing what they want to see. Thought about Gideon's voice, flat and certain. The children are doing better. She thought about leaving anyway, not because it was the right thing, but because it might be the necessary one. Because she'd grown up watching her mother make necessary decisions that weren't right, and she understood the difference between them in a way that a happier childhood might not have taught her. She turned over, pressed her face into the pillow. She didn't want to leave. That was the problem. She'd stopped thinking of herself as someone passing through and had started, without deciding to, without noticing the exact moment it happened, thinking of this kitchen, this table, these children, this cold and drafty and beautiful house as something she was part of. It scared her, the wanting of it. It made her feel exposed in a way that no amount of frontier hardship had managed. She thought about Nora's small hands gripping her wrist in the dark. She thought about Eli making bread, pressing down with his thin shoulders. She thought about Maeve choosing the word kind and saying it like it was a concession she'd fought for. She got out of bed, went to the kitchen, made herself warm milk because she couldn't sleep, and sat at the table in the dark the same way she sat with Nora on the nights the little girl couldn't sleep. Just present. Waiting for the feeling to pass or settle or become something she could manage. It settled. Not comfortably, but enough. She went back to bed before dawn. The quilt came together in the third week of November, on a Sunday afternoon when the sky was the particular flat white that means weather coming. They'd spread the completed panels on the kitchen floor to assess what remained, and the answer was, not much. 2 more sections of stitching, an hour's work if they all applied themselves. Maeve sent Eli to get their father. Gideon stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the quilt on the floor. Almost finished now. The blue and cream rings complete enough that the whole pattern was clear, his wife's careful stitching threaded through with his daughter's and Lenora's like 3 different voices in the same sentence. Come sit down, Maeve said. Help us finish it. He said nothing for a long moment. Papa, Nora said from her place on the floor next to the fabric. Mama would want you to. It was the most Nora had said in a single sentence to her father since before Clara died. Everyone in the room heard it and felt it, but nobody made a thing of it, because making a thing of it would have broken something. Gideon walked in and sat down on the floor next to his youngest daughter. Lenora handed him a needle, already threaded, already knotted at the end, ready for him, and he took it and looked at it for a second as though he wasn't sure what his hands were supposed to do. Nora took the edge of the quilt and put it in his lap. He started stitching. He was not good at it. His stitches were too long and slightly uneven, and Maeve quietly repositioned the fabric for him twice without comment, and after a while his hands found a steadier rhythm and the work became less clumsy. They finished the quilt that afternoon, all 5 of them on the kitchen floor, with the white sky pressing down outside the windows, and the stove making its sounds, and the thread going in and out of the fabric until the last seam was closed. Lenora knotted it off and cut the thread. The quiet in the kitchen after was the kind that has weight. Nora reached out and pulled the finished quilt into her lap. It was heavy with all the fabric, draped across her legs, bigger than she was. She smoothed the top of it with both hands. Clara's oldest squares, the ones from the very beginning, next to the new ones, next to the ones Eli had sorted and Maeve had cut and Lenora had pressed. She looked up at her father. It's done, she said. Gideon's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and slightly rough around the edges. It's done, he agreed. The moment might have held longer, but it was Eli who broke it, because Eli was 9 and had been patient for about as long as 9-year-olds are physically capable of being patient. Can we have supper now? He said. I'm starving. And Lenora laughed, an actual, unguarded laugh, the kind she'd almost forgotten she had, and the tension in the room tipped over into something lighter. And even Gideon's face did that thing again, that thing that was almost a smile. She started supper. But the talk in town was not going to be softened by a finished quilt. She heard about the meeting at the church hall from Maeve, who heard it from a girl at school, who heard it from her mother. A gathering of several prominent families, the Stantons among them, naturally, had convened to discuss, formally, their concern about the welfare of the Blackthorn children. The phrase concern petition had been used. The possibility of involving the county's family authority, a man named Dewhurst who processed orphan cases and custody disputes from the Clearfield office, had been raised. Maeve told her on a Thursday evening, standing in the kitchen, her voice carefully level in the way she'd learned to be careful and level when she was most afraid. "They're saying they might petition to have us placed with another family," Maeve said, "temporarily, while the situation is investigated." The word investigated landed like a dropped stone. "Who said that?" Lenore asked. "Mrs. Harmon. She told her daughter, who told—" Maeve made a gesture. "It's in town now. Everybody knows." "Does your father know?" Maeve looked at her. "He came home tonight and went straight to the barn. He hasn't come in for supper yet." Lenora wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the pot on the stove, supper ready, table set, 3 children waiting, and 1 man in a barn she hadn't gone to check on. She went out to the barn. He was there with one of the horses, doing something to its rear shoe that might or might not have needed doing. His back was to the door. "I heard," Lenora said. "Go inside, Miss Vale." "In a minute." She stepped into the barn and closed the door against the cold. "They're not going to take your children." He kept working on the shoe. "You don't know that. I know that what they're describing, what they're suggesting, they'd need proof of actual harm. And there isn't any, because there isn't any harm." She stepped closer. "Your children are fed, clothed, warm, and going to school. Eli is recovering from a genuine fever that you and I both stayed up 3 nights over. Maeve is functioning. Nora is talking." He set down the hoof and straightened up, turned around. In the barn light, he looked older than 35, but also somehow younger, less composed, more visible. "They can make things very difficult," he said, "even without proof. Dewhurst has removed children for less. Then you fight it." "I don't get—" He stopped. "I don't know how to fight that kind of thing. A man on his own against—" "You're not on your own." He looked at her, straight, direct, for a moment longer than either of them was used to. "No," he said slowly, like he was recalibrating something. "No, I suppose I'm not." He came in to supper. He sat at the table and ate and talked to his children, and it wasn't easy for him. She could see the effort it cost him, but he did it. He asked Eli about his reading. He asked Maeve about her schoolwork. He told Nora a brief, slightly awkward story about something that had happened with one of the younger calves, and Nora listened with wide eyes and didn't laugh, but came as close as Nora had come to laughing in a long time. Lenora sat at the table and ate and didn't say anything beyond what was needed, and watched this family she had not planned to love try, imperfectly and earnestly and with the particular stubbornness of people who have already survived so much, to be whole. After the children were in bed, after the kitchen was cleaned and the fire banked and the house settled into its nighttime creaking, Gideon stopped her in the hallway. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight." She looked at him. The hallway was narrow and the lamp was low, and he was close enough that she was aware of it. "I didn't do anything. You came to the barn." He seemed to think that was sufficient explanation. She nodded and went to her room. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind gathering strength from the north. Cold this time, different from the cold of the past weeks, thicker, with a purpose to it. She thought about leaving, still thought about leaving. The thought wouldn't quite let go, the way responsible thoughts don't when there's a real case for them. If she stayed and Vera Stanton followed through, if Dewhurst got involved, if this family she had come to love paid a price for her presence that they could not afford, she would not be able to forgive herself for it. She would not. The love she had for them was not the kind that took things. It was the kind that would let go first, if letting go was what protected them. But Maeve's voice in her head, "People see what they want to see." And Gideon's, "You're not on your own." And Nora's small hands on her wrist in the dark kitchen, holding on. She didn't decide anything that night. She just lay there with the wind growing louder outside the window and waited. And the cold pressed in from the north like something that had made up its mind long before any of them had. She had packed her bag by 3 in the morning. Not everything, just what she'd brought. The 2 changes of clothes, the hairbrush, the tin mirror, the unfinished book. She folded each thing carefully, set it in the bag with the same attention she'd given every task in this house, because she didn't know how to do things carelessly, and she wasn't going to start now. The bag sat on the end of the bed, and she sat next to it in the dark and waited for herself to feel certain. She didn't feel certain. She felt like she was making a responsible decision that was also breaking something she hadn't known she was building until now. The wind had been growing all night. She could hear it working against the house. Not the usual frontier cold, but something with genuine intent behind it, pressing at the window frames, finding the gaps in the timber. She'd checked the wood box before coming to her room, stoked both stoves, left enough in the kitchen that the house would stay warm until morning without anyone needing to go out. Small things. The kind of things you do when you're trying to leave a place better than you found it. She was reaching for her coat when the knock came at her door. 3 knocks. Small knuckles. She opened it. Maeve stood in the hallway in her nightgown, her dark hair loose, her feet bare on the cold floor. She was 13 years old, and she was not crying, but she was close to it in the way that people who don't cry easily get close. Everything pulled tight, jaw set, eyes too bright. She looked at the bag on the bed. Lenora didn't say anything. "You're leaving," Maeve said. "Maeve, you were just going to go," without saying anything. Her voice was careful and controlled, and the control was costing her. "Like it didn't matter, like we didn't—" She stopped. "It matters," Lenora said. "That's why I'm leaving. Because it matters." "That doesn't make any sense." "It does. If I stay, your aunt is going to use me as a reason to take you away from your father. And I won't—" She stopped, tried again. "I won't let that happen to this family because of me. I'm not worth that." Maeve stared at her. "Who told you that you weren't worth that?" The question landed somewhere unexpected. Lenora felt it in her sternum. "Maeve, go back to bed." "No." The word was quiet and absolute, like her father's no in the barn. "You don't get to decide that you matter less than the rest of us. You don't get to pack a bag in the middle of the night and just—" She stopped again, pressing her lips together hard. "We need you here. You were managing before I came. We were surviving," Maeve said. "That's different." Her voice finally cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough to show the 13-year-old under the controlled exterior. "Eli made bread last week. Nora told me a joke, an actual joke, for the first time since Mama. Papa sat on the floor and finished the quilt with us." She took a breath. "None of that happened before you. None of it." Lenora sat back down on the edge of the bed. Not because she'd decided, just because her legs needed a moment. My aunt is wrong," Maeve said. "And deep down I think she knows it. I think she's scared because she misses Mama, and she sees you in this house and it makes her miss her more. But that's not your fault." She walked across the small room and sat down next to Lenora on the narrow bed, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Stay," she said. "Please." The wind hit the house hard enough to shutter the walls. Lenora looked at the bag, looked at the window, where the first gray light was beginning to show, except it wasn't quite gray. It was the particular flat white she'd seen in the sky 2 days ago, the color that meant the weather had stopped being a possibility and had become a fact. She reached over and put her arm around Maeve's shoulders. The girl leaned in just slightly, like she was making herself do it. "Okay," Lenora said. "Okay." She unpacked the bag in the dark while Maeve sat on the bed and watched, and neither of them spoke. And the wind kept building outside like something that had been patient long enough. The storm arrived at dawn. It came with a speed that frontier people knew to fear, the kind of storm that doesn't announce itself gradually, but simply arrives all at once, as though it had been waiting just over the ridge and finally decided. Lenora woke from 2 hours of thin sleep to the sound of something hitting the house that wasn't just wind, a horizontal driving snow that turned the yard invisible and the barn into a gray shape, and the fence line into a suggestion. She was in the kitchen starting the fire when she heard it, Eli's cough. Not a regular cough. Not the kind of cough that children get with cold air. She heard it from the foot of the stairs and felt her stomach drop before her mind had finished the thought. She went up. He was in his bed, and even in the dim morning light she could see the flush on him. She put her hand to his forehead the way she'd put it there a month ago. Worse. This was worse than the first time. She didn't let herself stand there feeling it. She went to Gideon's room and knocked hard. He was awake, or had been sleeping that thin frontier sleep that men who worry a lot develop, where the difference between sleeping and waking is minimal. "It's Eli again," she said when he opened the door. "The fever's come back. It's higher than before." She watched him understand it, the quickness of it, the process of a man who's afraid moving through that fear into the part where he does things. "Henley?" he said. "The doctor. He's in Clearfield." "How far?" 14 miles. He moved past her into the hallway, toward Eli's room. She followed. He put his hand on the boy's forehead, and the look that crossed his face was the look of a parent confronting the thing they most dread. "I have to go get him," Gideon said. Lenora looked at the window. The snow was already coming so hard it had covered the lower half of the glass. "In this? There's no other way." She wanted to argue. She could see several good reasons to argue. The storm, the 14 miles, the frozen ground, the visibility that was already near nothing. But she looked at Eli's face on the pillow, the flush and the shallowed breath, and she understood that Gideon had already made the calculation and it had only one answer. "All right," she said, Go. I'll stay with him." He looked at her. A look she was starting to understand, the one he used when he wanted to say something he didn't have the words for yet. "I know," she said. "Go." She heard him downstairs getting his coat, his boots, his rifle for the ride. Heard him go out into the storm and felt the house shudder when the door closed behind him. Heard the barn doors, then nothing. Just the wind and the snow and the enormity of what was happening outside. She turned to the boy on the bed. "I'm right here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Eli's eyes opened slightly. He looked at her with the bleary, half-present look of someone in fever, and he said, "I know," and closed them again. She stayed. She sent Maeve for more blankets and had her bring the tin basin and set Nora to keeping the wood stove loaded in the hall, because the hall was where the cold came through worst, and Eli's room shared a wall with it. Maeve moved quickly and without argument, and Lenora had one clear thought in the middle of everything. This is what this girl would have become regardless. Capable, steady, responsible under pressure. And all she'd ever needed was someone to take some of the weight so she didn't get crushed by it. The fever climbed through the morning. Lenora used cold cloths on Eli's forehead and the back of his neck, changed them every 10 minutes, talked to him when he was coherent, and kept her voice level when he wasn't. At some point he became confused, called her mama once, and she felt that word go through her like cold water, and she did not correct him. She just said, "I'm here," which was true regardless of what name he used. Nora appeared in the doorway around mid-morning. "Is he going to be okay?" she said. "Yes," Lenora said. She said it the way her mother should have said things, the way adults should say things to children when the truth is uncertain, but the alternative is worse. Not lying, exactly, making a promise and intending to keep it. "Do you swear?" "Yes," Lenora said. "I swear." Nora looked at her for a long moment, this 6-year-old with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and something in her face decided. She walked into the room, climbed onto the bed on the far side from Eli, and lay down next to her brother without touching him, just close. A presence. The way Lenora herself had learned to be. Just present, just there, just making the room less empty. Lenora looked at the two of them and then looked back at the cold cloth in her hands and kept working. Around noon, Eli's temperature peaked. She knew it had peaked because he stopped thrashing and went very still. And the particular quality of his stillness was the kind that scares you badly until you realize it's the body conserving itself, not giving up. She'd seen a younger brother through something like this once, years ago, and she held on to that knowledge like a rope. She kept the cloths cold. She kept talking. When Nora fell asleep beside her brother, Lenora pulled the finished quilt up over both of them, the only extra blanket in the room that was heavy enough to matter. Clara's quilt. Nora's quilt. The one they had all sat on the kitchen floor and finished together on a Sunday afternoon when the sky was white and Gideon had sat with his children for the first time in 14 months and let himself be part of something. Lenora tucked it around Eli's shoulders, and around Nora pressed against him, and she let herself have the thought she'd been keeping at arm's length. If this boy dies in this bed while his father is riding 14 miles through a blizzard to save him, I will not recover from that. I will not. She pressed the cloth to his forehead. "Don't you dare," she said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just to the room, to the fever, to the storm outside. Don't you dare. Maeve brought her soup at some point in the early afternoon, set it on the bedside table without speaking, looked at her brother, at Nora, at the quilt over both of them. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was feeling something she wouldn't allow herself to show. "He looks worse," Maeve said. "He peaked about an hour ago. It should start to come down now." "Should," Lenora agreed. She didn't pretend. "Go keep the fires going, Maeve, and watch the front window. Tell me when you see the road." Maeve went. The fever began to ease in the mid-afternoon. Slowly. Nothing quick about it. Nothing that felt like relief so much as the very gradual loosening of a grip. Eli's color changed by degrees, the dangerous scarlet fading towards something more human, his breathing deepening incrementally. Lenora changed cloths and waited and changed cloths and waited and listened to the storm against the windows with the particular attention of someone who needs to know everything that's happening outside, because they cannot be outside. Gideon made it back with the doctor at near dusk. She heard them before she saw them. The horses, then Maeve calling from downstairs, then boots on the porch, and then on the stairs, heavy and fast. The bedroom door opened and Gideon came through it first, snow still on his shoulders, face raw from the cold, and behind him a compact gray-haired man with a black bag that meant everything. Gideon looked at his son, looked at Lenora. "He's better," she said immediately. The fever peaked midday. It's been coming down. Gideon's eyes closed for just a second, 1 second. Dr. Henley moved past him to the bed with the brisk, unhurried manner of a man who has seen enough of the worst things to stay calm in their presence. He examined Eli thoroughly, pulse, breathing, temperature, the color of his eyes, and the condition of his throat, while Lenora answered questions about when the fever had started and how high it had gotten and what she'd done. Henley listened, nodded, asked 2 follow-up questions. "You did everything right," he said, without looking up from his bag. She didn't say anything. There didn't seem to be anything to say. He left medicine on the bedside table, gave instructions, said the boy would need 10 days of rest at minimum and would bear watching through the night. "I'll stay with him," Lenora said. "Good." Henley snapped his bag closed and straightened up and looked at her for the first time. A direct, assessing look of the kind that doctors give when they're seeing a person rather than a patient. "How long have you been at it today?" "Since before dawn." "Have you eaten?" She couldn't immediately remember. "I think so." "Maeve," Gideon said from the doorway where he'd been standing since the doctor started the examination, watching. Maeve appeared. "Get Lenora something to eat, and make sure she actually eats it." Maeve looked at Lenora. "Come on." Lenora started to say she needed to stay with Eli, but Gideon moved past the doctor and sat down in the chair beside the bed, still in his coat, snow still melting in his hair, and he took his son's hand gently, and that settled it. She went to the kitchen. She sat at the table and ate what Maeve put in front of her without tasting it. Her hands were steady, which surprised her a little. She'd expected them to shake now that the crisis had passed, but they were just hands, tired, capable, steady. Maeve sat across from her. "Were you scared?" Maeve said. "Terrified." "You didn't seem it." "You're not supposed to seem it. You're the adult in the room." She ate another spoonful. "Were you scared?" "Yes." No hesitation. "But I kept the fires going." "You did," Lenora said. "You were perfect." "I wasn't perfect. I burned my hand on the stove at one point and said something I'm not supposed to say in front of Nora." Despite herself, Lenora laughed. It came out rough, shortened, the laugh of someone who's been holding their breath all day. "What did you say?" Maeve told her. Lenora laughed again, longer this time, and Maeve pressed her mouth together in a way that was fighting a smile and losing. "Don't tell Papa," Maeve said. "I won't." They sat in the kitchen while the storm pressed against the house, and the fires kept the cold back, And upstairs, Gideon sat beside his son, and it wasn't a perfect moment. It was an exhausted, faintly smoky, slightly burnt hand moment, but it was the realest thing Lenora had felt in a long time, and she held on to it without trying to make it into something else. What she didn't know, what none of them knew until later, was that the doctor had not come alone. He'd brought 3 people from town with him. They had followed his horse through the blizzard, apparently, on the strength of Gideon's desperate ride through Harrow. He'd stopped long enough to pound on Henley's door and then kept moving. But people had seen him, and some of them had followed, partly out of concern and partly out of the less generous impulse that makes people want to see things for themselves. Vera Stanton was one of them. She'd sent her husband and come herself, which said something about her, whether you chose to read it charitably or not. They were downstairs in the front room when Lenora came back up from the kitchen. She didn't know they were there until she nearly walked into Vera in the hallway. They stood looking at each other. Vera's traveling clothes were still damp from the ride. Her face was drawn in a way that might have been the cold, or might have been the 14 miles of winter road, or might have been something else. "How is he?" Vera said. Her voice was different from the other times, stripped of something. "Better," Lenora said. "The doctor thinks he'll be all right if he rests." Vera nodded. Her eyes went to the bedroom door, then back to Lenora. "I was told, She stopped, started again. "Someone said the boy was very bad." "He was." Another silence. "Who stayed with him?" Vera said. "While Gideon went for the doctor." Lenora held her gaze. "I did." Vera looked at her, and Lenora saw it. The exact moment Vera looked past her own arithmetic, past 14 months of protective watchfulness, past the story she'd decided to believe, and looked at what was actually in front of her. A tired 18-year-old girl in a damp apron who'd spent 12 hours fighting a fever by herself in a blizzard so that the children Vera loved would still have a brother by morning. The hallway was narrow, and the lamp between them was low. Vera said, "I should go see him." "He's sleeping. His father is with him." Lenora stepped aside. "Knock softly." Vera moved past her, and at the bedroom door she paused with her hand raised to knock. "Miss Vale," she said, without turning around. "Yes." A pause that lasted several seconds. "Thank you," Vera Stanton said, "for my sister's children." She knocked softly and went in. Lenora stood in the empty hallway and let the silence settle around her and breathed out slowly. And it was not a triumphant moment, and it was not a resolved moment. It was just a moment, the kind that happens in the middle of things, before you know whether they'll turn out the way you need them to. She went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because there were people in the house, and people needed something warm, and that was something she knew how to do. The storm broke overnight, the way big storms do. Not gradually, but all at once. The wind dropping off sometime before dawn and leaving behind the particular silence of a world that has been rearranged. Lenora stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and looked out at a yard transformed. The fence posts buried to their crossbars, the barn roof smooth and white, the path to the outhouse completely gone. The sky above was the pale, washed-out blue that comes after violence, cleaner than anything normal weather produces. Eli had made it through the night. She knew this before she went upstairs to check, because she'd heard him coughing at around 4 in the morning, a regular cough, a getting better cough, the kind that meant the lungs were clearing rather than drowning. She'd gone up anyway and found Gideon still in the chair beside the bed, asleep finally, his head tilted against the wall at an angle that was going to punish his neck for days. Eli was sleeping properly, his color something close to normal, his breathing slow and even. She'd stood in the doorway and let herself feel it, the relief, the enormous physical weight of it releasing from somewhere between her shoulders. And then she'd gone back downstairs and made coffee and waited for the house to wake up. The townspeople who'd come through the storm had stayed the night. There was nothing else to be done. The roads were impassable, and the storm had made that decision for everyone. Vera Stanton and the 2 others, a man named Greer who served on the church council and his wife, had slept in the front room on whatever Lenora could pull together in the way of blankets and cushions. Dr. Henley had taken the chair in Eli's room when Gideon finally slept. It was a crowded, ungainly arrangement that nobody had chosen, the kind of situation that strips away the comfortable distance people maintain when they've decided something about someone they haven't actually spent time with. Vera came downstairs first, around 7. She stood in the kitchen doorway in her rumpled traveling dress, her fair hair pinned back with less precision than usual, and looked at Lenora at the stove. "Coffee's ready," Lenora said. Vera sat down at the table. She took the cup Lenora set in front of her and held it in both hands and didn't say anything for a moment. "How did you sleep?" Lenora said. "I didn't, much." Vera looked into her cup. "I kept listening." "He's better. I checked at 4. Vera nodded. Another silence, but a different quality of silence from the ones between them before. Less armored. "I owe you an apology," Vera said. Lenora turned back to the stove. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear it said directly. Sometimes apologies made things more formal than they needed to be, fixed things in place when they were better left to settle on their own. But she said nothing, and Vera continued. "I decided something about you before I knew anything about you," Vera said. "I decided it because it was easier than—" She stopped. "Clara was my younger sister. She was the best person I've ever known, and when she died, I think I needed someone to protect. Her children. Her place in that house. I needed something to do with the grief, and protecting them felt like keeping her alive somehow." She set her cup down. "But I protected in the wrong direction. I looked outward for threats when what those children needed was for someone to come in." Lenora turned around. Vera was looking at the table, not at her. "You don't have to," Lenora started. "I do," Vera said, "because what I was doing, the petition, the talk with Dewhurst, that could have taken those children away from their father, from a man who loves them and is doing his best by them, and from you." She finally looked up. "You stayed in this house through a blizzard with a dying boy, and not one moment of it was for any reason other than because you loved them. I can see that now. I should have seen it sooner." Lenora sat down across from her. The kitchen was warm and the coffee was hot, and outside the world was buried in white. And she thought of the right thing to say, and then said a different thing, because it was more honest. "I understand why you didn't," she said. "I'm 18 and I came from nowhere and I moved into a grieving man's house. That looks like something, from the outside. I understand why it looked like that." Vera's mouth pressed together. "It shouldn't have been enough." "But it was, and that's all right. People see what they have in front of them." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "What matters is what happens now." Vera looked at her for a long moment, a different kind of looking than before, clear and direct, without the arithmetic behind it. "Clara would have liked you," she said. "I mean that." Lenora didn't know what to do with that, so she just nodded and got up to make breakfast. Gideon came downstairs an hour later, moving stiffly from the night in the chair, his neck at a careful angle that confirmed her earlier suspicion. He stopped in the kitchen doorway at the sight of Vera at the table, the Greers nearby with their own cups, Lenora at the stove with a pan of cornbread coming together. He took all of it in with a single look. "Eli's better," Lenora said without turning around. "Fever's down. Henley says he can have broth this morning." She heard Gideon let out a long breath. "Gideon," Vera said. "Vera." His voice was careful. "Sit down. There are things I need to say to you." He sat. Lenora kept her back to the table and worked on breakfast and let the conversation happen without involving herself in it, because it wasn't her conversation to be part of. She heard Vera's voice, low and steady, heard Gideon's responses, short at first, then longer. She couldn't make out all of it over the sounds of the stove, and that was fine. That was the point. What she heard clearly was Gideon's voice at one point, not loud but distinct. "I know what's best for my family. I've always known." And Vera's response, "Yes, I'm beginning to think you do." Greer said almost nothing throughout breakfast. His wife ate 2 pieces of cornbread and complimented the kitchen, looking around at the herbs on the beams and the big pine table with its 8 years of scratches, and said it was a lovely room. Lenora thanked her and thought of Clara, who had put real thought into this room. Henley left after breakfast, once the roads were passable enough for his horse. He examined Eli one final time, left written instructions, and shook Gideon's hand at the door. At the threshold, he turned around and looked at Lenora, who was standing in the hallway. "You've got a good head," he said. "Under pressure. That's rare." "Thank you, Doctor." He put his hat on and went out into the white. The Greers left an hour later. Vera stayed. She stayed for the better part of the day, upstairs with Eli for a while, then in the kitchen with Lenora, then in the front room with Nora, reading to her from one of the children's books while Nora sat pressed against her aunt's side, in the particular way she'd once pressed against Lenora's skirt. Maeve moved through the house doing chores with an eye on her aunt that was watchful at first, and then, gradually, less so. When Vera finally left in the late afternoon, she stopped in the front doorway and turned around and looked at Lenora one more time. "The petition," she said. "I'm going to withdraw it." "Thank you," Gideon said, from somewhere behind Lenora. Vera looked at him, then at Lenora. Something resolved in her face that had been unresolved for months. "Take care of them," she said. Not to either of them specifically, to both of them. She went out into the white. Eli recovered in increments, as children do, going from gravely still to demanding soup to complaining about being bored in the space of about 4 days. By the 6th day, he was sitting up arguing with Maeve about which of them was better at arithmetic, which Lenora took as a complete return to health. By the 9th day, he was asking to come downstairs, and Gideon carried him down and set him up near the kitchen stove with his school books and a lap blanket, and Eli proceeded to do about 15 minutes of schoolwork and then fall asleep sitting upright, which was also a good sign. The town was a different problem. Vera withdrawing the petition helped, but it didn't reset 14 months of accumulated opinion. Harrow County had been talking about Blackthorn Ranch since before Lenora arrived, and people who have been talking about something for long enough develop a kind of ownership over their version of it. The gossip didn't vanish overnight. What changed was its energy. It lost some of the urgency, the edge of righteousness that makes rumors feel like duty. It became more ordinary gossip, and ordinary gossip runs out of fuel faster than the kind that comes with moral outrage attached. But there was still the matter of the church council meeting. Greer had said, when he left, that the council had scheduled a gathering for the following Sunday, a formal one with several families present, to address the situation at Blackthorn Ranch. He'd said it in the careful voice of a man who wasn't sure if he was delivering a warning or an invitation. Gideon told Lenora that evening. "You should go," she said immediately. "I know." He was at the table again. Account book open but untouched. "The question is whether you should." She thought about it. Her first instinct was no. Let him go. Let him handle it. Stay out of the way and let the situation settle on its own terms. She'd been doing that for 2 months, staying quiet, keeping her head down, earning her place through the work, and letting the work speak. But she thought about Maeve in the hallway at 3 in the morning, bare feet on the cold floor, saying, "You don't get to decide that you matter less than the rest of us." She thought about staying because Maeve had asked her to stay. She thought about everything she'd swallowed in 2 months, every appraising look, every half-heard comment, every loaded word spoken sweetly by women in dry goods stores. She'd been quiet. She'd been appropriate. She'd been exactly as small as the situation seemed to require, and the situation was still happening anyway. "I'm going," she said. Gideon looked at her. "I'm going," she said again. "If they're going to say things about me, I want to be in the room." A pause. "It might make it worse, or it might not." She held his gaze. "I'm tired of making decisions based on what other people might think of them. I've been doing that since I got here, and it hasn't helped." She looked at her hands on the table. "I'd rather say my piece and have it settled one way or another than keep waiting for something I can't control to resolve itself." He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. "We go together." Sunday came gray and cold. The snow still thick on the ground, but the roads passable now, frozen solid. They rode into Harrow in the wagon, Gideon and Lenora, Maeve insisting on coming and being allowed to after a brief argument that she won through sheer calm. Eli stayed home with Nora, both of them under strict instructions from Lenora about the fire and the medicine and which shelf the broth pot was on. The church hall was fuller than Lenora expected. She'd imagined a handful of council members, some neighbors. What she walked into was most of the town. The Greers, the Stantons, the feed merchant and his wife, the dry goods women, a dozen others she knew by face and not by name. They'd all come, some out of concern and some out of the less charitable thing that makes people come to public confrontations. The room went quiet when Gideon walked in, went quieter when they saw Lenora behind him. Vera Stanton was there. She met Lenora's eyes and gave a small nod that meant something, though Lenora wasn't entirely sure what. Greer called the meeting to order with the slightly pained efficiency of a man who isn't enjoying the position he's in. He summarized the concerns that had been raised: the youth of the hired girl, the nature of the household, the questions about propriety, and the careful both sides language of someone who'd prepared his words. Then he opened the floor. The first person to speak was a woman named Mrs. Aldis, whose daughter attended school with Maeve, and what she said was not kind. It was phrased in the language of concern. She was worried about the children. She was worried about the example being set. She simply felt that there were questions that hadn't been answered. But underneath the phrasing, the message was plain enough. She thought Lenora was after something. She thought the situation was improper. She thought the Blackthorn children deserved better. Lenora sat and listened. Two more people spoke in similar veins. The room had the particular tension of a place where everyone knows something is about to happen and nobody's sure what. Then Gideon stood up. He didn't clear his throat or prepare himself visibly. He just stood, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet for people who don't speak often, but mean it when they do. "I'm going to say this once," he said, "and I need all of you to actually hear it." The room was absolutely still. 14 months ago, my wife died and this family went dark. That's the only word for it. Dark. My children were surviving and I was surviving, and none of us were doing much beyond that. He paused. Not for effect. For truth. The way people pause when they're finding the right words rather than performing them. Lenora Vale came to my house with one bag and a hunger she was too proud to mention, and she asked for nothing except to earn her place. She didn't replace anything or anyone. She didn't try to. What she did was... He stopped. She brought the light back. That's what she did. She sat with my son through a fever and a blizzard for 12 hours by herself, and she finished my wife's quilt with my children, and she made this house feel like a home again, instead of a place where people were waiting for permission to grieve. Nobody spoke. "I understand appearances," Gideon said. "I know what this looked like. I know she's young, and she came from somewhere none of you know, and she arrived in circumstances that are easy to misread. But I'm telling you, as this family's father, that there is nothing in this situation except a good person doing good work and a family that is healing because of it." He looked around the room. "If any of you have a specific grievance, a specific harm you believe has been done, say it now. I'll answer it. But if what you have is suspicion based on assumptions about a girl you've never spoken to, then I'd ask you to consider whether your assumptions are worth more than my children's well-being, because in my experience, they're not." He sat down. The silence held for a moment that was slightly too long, and then Lenora stood up. She hadn't planned to. She'd thought Gideon's words would be enough, and maybe they were, but she found herself standing anyway, because Maeve had asked her to stay, and she'd stayed, and staying meant being here, and being here meant being seen. "I want to say something," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her a little. "I'm 18 years old, and I came here from a family that was starving. That's the truth of it, plain. I came here because Mrs. Aldrich found a family that needed help and I needed work, and there was nothing more complicated than that in the beginning." She looked around the room, not aggressively, just directly. The way she'd looked at Gideon on the first day when she'd asked whether he thought she was a threat. "But I need to say something about what's been said, about me replacing Clara Blackthorn." She let the name land in the room, didn't soften it. "You can't replace someone who mattered. That's not how love works. Clara Blackthorn loved her children and her husband and her home, and she is in that house everywhere you look. In the kitchen she designed, in the quilt her daughter learned to sew by watching her, in the way Eli makes bread because he saw his mother make it, in the way Nora holds on to people because her mother taught her that's what you do when you love someone." She paused. "I am not Clara Blackthorn. I'm not trying to be. What I'm trying to do is make sure that family has enough warmth and enough food and enough steadiness to remember her the right way. Not as a loss that paralyzed them, but as someone worth honoring by being whole." The room was quiet. "I know what you saw," she said. "A young woman in a widower's house. I know what that looks like, and I understand why it looked that way. But I need you to also see what's true, which is that those 3 children are doing better than they've done in over a year. And their father is doing better. And I've worked every day to make that happen without asking for anything except the chance to be useful." She looked down for just a second and then back up. "That's all I have. I just didn't want it said without being in the room." She sat down. The silence after was different from the silence before. It was Vera who broke it. She stood, which Lenora hadn't expected, and when she spoke her voice was clear and carried easily through the room. "I was the one who went to Dewhurst," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I was the one who pushed hardest for this to become a formal matter, and I was wrong." She stood straight, the way people stand when they're doing something hard that needs doing. "I watched this young woman spend the worst night of recent memory keeping my nephew alive, and I watched her do it with a steadiness and a love that Clara would have recognized." She paused. "I'm withdrawing any formal concern, and I'd ask the rest of you to consider doing the same with your informal ones." She sat down. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. It wasn't the kind of moment that happens all at once. But Lenora could feel it, the same way she'd felt weather coming in. A change in pressure, the angle of things settling differently. Mrs. Aldous didn't speak again. Greer said a few closing words about the community's responsibility to look after its own, by which he now seemed to mean Lenora was included in that category, and the meeting was adjourned with less fanfare than it had begun with. In the doorway, on the way out, a woman Lenora didn't know. Middle-aged, plain-dressed, the kind of woman who doesn't talk much in public settings, stopped her with a hand briefly on her arm. "You did good by those kids," the woman said quietly. "My name is Frances Poole. I live 2 miles east of you on the Ridge Road. If you ever need anything," she pressed her lips together, "you just know where I am." Then she moved on, and Lenora stood in the doorway of the Harrow Church Hall, with the cold air coming in from outside and Gideon behind her, and Maeve slightly behind him, and she let herself have 30 seconds of something that wasn't quite peace, but was in that direction. The ride home was quiet. Maeve sat in the back of the wagon and didn't say anything for the first mile, which with Maeve meant she was processing. Then, "You didn't have to stand up." "I know," Lenora said, "but you did." "Yes." Another silence. "I'm glad," Maeve said. Just that. She pulled her coat tighter and looked at the frozen road ahead and didn't say anything else. And next to her, Gideon drove the horses with his usual economy of movement, and the white fields opened out on both sides of the road, and the sky was the pale-washed blue of after-storms, and it was not a triumphant ride home. It was just a ride home, cold and quiet and ordinary, and that ordinariness was the best thing about it. When they got back, Eli was asleep in the kitchen chair with his school book fallen into his lap. Nora was at the table drawing something on a piece of paper with the intense concentration of a person doing important work. She looked up when they came in. "How was it?" she said. "Fine," Lenora said. She hung up her coat. "How's your brother?" "He woke up for a bit and ate soup." Nora looked at her drawing, then back up. "I made you something." She pushed the paper across the table. It was a drawing in the unsteady hand of a 6-year-old. 4 figures of varying heights in front of a rectangular shape that was probably the house. The 2 tallest figures were side by side. The 3 smaller ones clustered around them. Above it, in careful letter-by-letter printing that had taken considerable effort, were the words, "Our family." Lenora looked at it for a long moment. She sat down at the table across from Nora and said, "It's beautiful." "I spelled family wrong," Nora said. "I know. I like it anyway." She set the drawing in the middle of the table where she could keep looking at it. Nora seemed satisfied with this and went back to her next drawing, and the kitchen filled with its ordinary sounds. The stove, Eli's breathing, the distant creak of the house. And Gideon came in and poured coffee and sat at the table and looked at the drawing and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some things don't require words. Lenora was beginning to understand that this family knew that better than most, had known it since before she came, and that maybe it was one of the things they'd taught her without meaning to, that presence is its own language, and sometimes the most honest thing you can do is simply stay in the room. Winter released its grip on Harrow County the way it always did. Not all at once, not with any particular generosity, but in slow degrees that you had to pay attention to notice. The snow receded from the fence posts first, then from the yard, then from the south-facing slope of the barn roof. The creek at the edge of the property, frozen solid since December, began to move again underneath. You could hear it before you could see it, a faint shifting sound that meant something was coming back to life below the surface. Eli noticed it first, the way children notice things that adults have stopped expecting. "The creek's running," he said one morning at breakfast with the authority of someone reporting important news. Nobody had asked. He just offered it, unprompted, because it seemed like information the table needed. He was fully recovered by then, had been for weeks, though Lenora still watched his color each morning with the habit of someone who'd been frightened badly enough that the fear had left a permanent groove. He'd grown half an inch since the fever, which Gideon had measured against the kitchen door frame with a pencil mark the way he apparently did every few months, a small ritual Lenore had discovered by accident and said nothing about, because some things didn't need commenting on. "Can we go down to the creek after school?" Eli said. "If it's warm enough," Gideon said. "It's warm enough." "I'll decide that." Eli looked at Lenora. "Don't," she said pleasantly. "Look at me." He looked back at his porridge. The morning routine had settled into something that felt, from the inside, like it had always been this way, which was the strange thing about routines, how quickly they absorbed themselves into the texture of ordinary life until you couldn't quite remember the before. Coffee at 6, Gideon already up, or Lenora already up, whoever got there first starting the fire. Breakfast at the big table with the scratches in it, the children arriving in their own order, Eli first because he was always hungry, Nora next because she followed him, Maeve last because she took her time about things and had strong opinions about not being rushed in the mornings. The particular quality of light in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, coming through Clara's window above the sink at exactly the angle Clara had designed it to. It wasn't perfect. It was a household, which means it was occasionally chaotic, frequently loud, and regularly frustrating in the small ways that living alongside other people is always frustrating. Eli broke a dish in February and lied about it for 20 minutes before confessing, which cost him 2 evenings of extra chores. Maeve had a period of 3 weeks in March where she was angry about something she refused to name and expressed this by being cold to everyone at the table, in a way that was technically polite and practically miserable. Nora had nightmares twice that month and appeared in Lenora's doorway at 2 in the morning, and Lenora brought her into the narrow bed because it fit 2 people if they didn't argue about space, and they lay there in the dark until the little girl's breathing slowed. These were not dramatic problems. They were the ordinary problems of an ordinary family, and there was something profound in that ordinariness. The way a household that had been frozen in exceptional grief had thawed into something as unremarkable and necessary as everyday life. Lenora had written to her mother in January. A real letter this time, not the clipped reports she'd been sending. She'd told her mother about the fever, about the storm, about the meeting in the church hall, about Nora's drawing still on the kitchen table, about the quilt on the chest at the foot of Eli's bed, which he'd claimed for his room and nobody argued with. She'd sent money with the letter. Not much, but more than she'd managed before, because Gideon had quietly raised her wages in December without any announcement. She'd found more coin in the envelope at the end of the month and counted it twice. She hadn't said anything to him about it. He hadn't mentioned it either. Her mother had written back in February in the cramped handwriting she used when she was trying to fit too much onto a single page. Both boys were well. The neighbor had given them work through the winter. The cow had calved early, and the calf was healthy. At the end of the letter, in a smaller hand, her mother had written, "I can tell from how you write that you have found something worth staying for. I am glad. Stay." She kept the letter in the tin box under her bed with the hairbrush and the mirror. The quilt had acquired a second life as the household's most contested comfort item. Nora had claimed it, as was her right. Eli had brought it downstairs himself and surrendered it with more grace than expected. And she kept it on the chair by the kitchen stove, which meant she was almost always somewhere near the kitchen stove, wrapped in it like a small determined burrito. Occasionally she allowed Eli under it if it was very cold. She did not allow anyone else. Except Lenora, once. On a March evening when the temperature dropped unexpectedly and the house couldn't quite keep up with the cold. Nora had appeared at the kitchen doorway, quilt dragging behind her on the floor, and wordlessly climbed onto the chair next to where Lenora was sitting and spread it over both of them. Lenora had looked at the top of Nora's head, brown hair against her shoulder, and held very still because some things you don't want to disturb. They'd sat like that for the better part of an hour, Lenora reading and Nora drawing, the quilt over both of them, Clara's old squares, and the new ones all mixed together in the blue and cream pattern until you couldn't easily say which was which. Gideon had come in from the barn and stopped at the sight of them. He'd poured his coffee and sat at the table and opened his account book, and the only thing he said was, "You're blocking the lamp." Lenora shifted the lamp. He opened his book. Nora didn't look up from her drawing. It was one of the best evenings Lenora could remember. Spring arrived properly in April. Not all at once. April on the frontier is argumentative, warm one day and cutting cold the next, the ground never quite committing. But the creek was fully running by the second week, and the first green was coming up along the fence line, and the calves were out in the lower pasture making the sounds that calves make when they've discovered legs and aren't sure yet whether to be delighted or alarmed. Gideon found Lenora in the garden in the third week of April. She'd been turning over the kitchen garden soil, which had been neglected for at least 2 seasons, and was compacted and resentful about it. It was work that required a good deal of effort and gave her time to think, which was partly why she liked it. The sun was warm on her back for the first time in months. She heard him coming and kept working. He stood at the edge of the turned soil for a moment. "You're putting in a kitchen garden," he said. "I'm trying to. The soil's a disaster." Claire used to complain about that same patch. She looked up at that. He said Clara's name differently now than he had in November. Less like a wound and more like a fact. Still careful, still intentional, but without that quality of bracing for pain. "What did she grow?" Lenora said. "Beans, tomatoes, some kind of squash that none of the children would eat." The corner of his mouth moved. "She grew it every year anyway." "Stubborn." "Yes." He looked at the turned soil. "Very." She went back to her digging. He stayed at the edge of the garden, which was unusual. Gideon, in a still moment, was unusual. He was normally moving from one task to the next with the energy of a man who'd turned busyness into a coping strategy. She waited. "I want to say something," he said. She rested the spade and looked at him. He was looking at the far fence line, the one that ran along the creek. A hawk was sitting on the post at the corner, which was not relevant to anything, but she noticed it. "I don't know how to say it the right way," he said. "I'm aware of that. I'm not—" He stopped. "You've met me. You know I'm not good at the words." "I know," she said, "but I've been—" He turned and looked at her directly, the way he did when the words cost him enough that he needed to look at the person he was spending them on. "I've been thinking about what this house was before you came and what it is now, and I don't think I've said that plainly enough. What you've done for them. For all of us." "You've said it." "Not plainly enough." She waited. He picked up a clod of soil from the edge of the garden, looked at it, set it back down. A man stalling. "I'd like to court you," he said. "Properly, with the intention of—" He paused. "With serious intention. Not because this ranch needs a woman to run it, although it does. Not because the children need a mother figure, although they—" He stopped again. "That's not the reason. The reason is— Gideon," he looked at her. "Ask me the question," she said. "Without the list of reasons that aren't it." He held her gaze. Something shifted in his face. The careful structure of it relaxing slightly. The way a door opens when someone finally tries it properly. "May I court you, Lenora?" She looked at him. Standing at the edge of her kitchen garden in his work coat with soil on his boots, a man who'd sat on the kitchen floor and sewn a quilt with his children, who'd ridden 14 miles through a blizzard on a horse, who'd stood up in the Harrow Church Hall and said, "You're not on your own in his own way," to a room full of people, who'd raised his son's wages without saying a word about it and kept the lamp burning when she was up late, and moved the account book to the far end of the table so there was room for her arms when she was mending. "Yes," she said, "you may." He nodded once. The thing that was almost a smile moved across his face. "I should probably—" He gestured at the barn. "You should probably get back to work," she agreed. He went. She turned back to her soil, which was still compacted and resentful, and she kept working, and she was smiling at the ground in the warm April sun in a way she was glad no one was there to see, because it was too wide and too unguarded and would have required explaining. She was still thinking about it an hour later when Maeve appeared. Maeve had taken to doing her schoolwork in the garden on warm afternoons, sitting on the upturned crate near the fence with her books, which Lenora suspected was less about the fresh air and more about the fact that Eli couldn't interrupt her out here. She set her things down and opened her Latin primer, and then looked sideways at Lenora. "Papa came out of the barn whistling," Maeve said. "Did he?" "He never whistles." Lenora kept turning soil. "Did something happen?" Maeve said. "We talked." A pause. Maeve was 13 3/4 by now, which in her case meant she had most of the observational capacity of an adult with none of the inclination to pretend she hadn't noticed things. "He asked you something," Maeve said. Not a question. Lenora looked up, met the girl's clear, steady gaze, Maeve's mother's eyes, in her father's face. "Yes," Lenora said. "And you said yes." "Yes." Maeve looked back at her primer. She was quiet for long enough that Lenora went back to her work, and the birds were loud in the fence trees, and the creek was running, and the calves made their uncertain sounds from the lower pasture. "Okay," Maeve said finally. Lenora looked up again. "I'm not saying I'm fine with everything all at once," Maeve said with her particular precision. "I'm saying okay, which means I heard it, and I think it makes sense, and I think—" She pressed her mouth together in that way she had. "I think Mama would think it made sense too, because you're not trying to be her. You never were. That's the thing I got wrong in the beginning." She looked down at her book. "I was waiting for you to try to replace her, and you never did, and eventually I figured out that was the point. I couldn't replace her," Lenora said. "She's in everything here." "I know." A pause. "That's why it's okay." She opened her primer and started reading, and Lenora went back to the soil, and neither of them said anything else about it, which was exactly right. Telling the children was not a formal announcement. It happened the way most honest things happen in this household. Sideways. In the middle of something else. Without ceremony. Eli found out from Maeve, predictably. He came to find Lenore in the kitchen the following morning while she was making biscuits, stood in the middle of the room for a moment, and then said, "Maeve says you and Papa are going to get married." "Eventually," Lenore said, "if things go as they should." He considered this. "Does that mean you'll stay here, for real? Not as the hired girl?" "Yes." "Good," he said. He sat down at the table and picked up his school book. "I didn't want you to leave. I told Nora last winter that if you left, I was going to run away and come find you, but I don't actually know where you're from, so it was mostly not a realistic plan." Lenore kept her face even, with some effort. "I appreciate the intention." "You're welcome." Nora had to be told separately, because Nora processed things in her own time and on her own terms, and always had. Gideon told her, sitting on the porch steps in the afternoon sun, just the two of them. Lenora watched from inside, through the kitchen window, not intending to spy but unable to look away. She saw him talk and saw Nora listen with the complete, solemn attention she gave important things. Saw her daughter's face go through several expressions she was too far away to read. Then Nora climbed into her father's lap, which she still did at 6 because she decided that was still acceptable, and nobody was going to argue with her about it, and leaned against his chest and said something Lenora couldn't see. Gideon put his arms around his youngest and rested his chin on top of her head and looked out at the yard with an expression that was too complicated to name from a distance, but that Lenora felt in her own chest nonetheless. That evening, Nora came to find her in the kitchen. She stood beside Lenora at the sink, watching her wash the supper things with the serious attentiveness she brought to important observation. "Papa says you're going to be part of our family," Nora said. "Yes." "He says it's a different kind of part than the hired girl part." "Yes." Nora picked up a dish and dried it, carefully, the way she'd been learning to do. Set it in the rack, picked up another. "I already thought of you as part of the family," she said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone clarifying a minor misconception. "Since the warm milk nights." Lenora looked at her. "Since the first time," Nora said, "when you came to the kitchen in the dark and you didn't make me go back to bed right away. You just stayed." She dried another dish. "That's when I decided." Lenora turned back to the wash water and didn't say anything for a moment, because her throat had done something that made speaking difficult. "I'm glad," she managed. "Me too," Nora said simply, and kept drying dishes. The formal courtship was, in the practical context of a working ranch with 3 children and approximately 900 tasks a day, slightly absurd. There were no formal calls or sitting room visits. The sitting room was where Eli did his schoolwork, and Maeve practiced her letters. There were no promenades or calling cards. What there was, instead, was the gradual, unhurried quality of 2 people who were already living inside the same life, finding out what it meant to do it deliberately. He asked her opinion on things he'd never asked about before. Which pasture to rest through summer, whether the barn needed a new loft before fall, what she thought of the soil quality in the north garden. She gave her opinions directly, and he listened to them, which was new, not because he hadn't respected her before, but because asking was different from noting, and the asking was a kind of language. She started telling him things she'd been keeping private, small things, that she missed her brothers more in spring than in winter because spring reminded her of planting season, and planting season had always been the good time at home, when there was enough work to keep everyone busy and enough hope to make it feel worth it. That she'd never finished the book she'd carried in her bag for 3 years, and wasn't sure she ever would, but kept it anyway because letting go of it felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. That she thought about her father sometimes, not with love, but with a complicated thing that wasn't quite anger anymore and wasn't forgiveness either. Just the residue of something unresolved that she was learning to carry without letting it set the direction. He listened to all of it. He didn't offer solutions or reassurances. He just listened, which was what she needed. And she recognized that what she'd mistaken for emotional distance in him was actually the opposite. It was the particular care of someone who listens fully because they know words aren't cheap. He told her things too, in his own time. About the early years of the ranch, the first winter that nearly broke them, the season the cattle were sick and he thought he'd lose everything. About Clara, not the grief of her, which they'd circled before, but the fact of her, the actual woman. Small things. She'd had a terrible singing voice and sang constantly anyway. She'd been afraid of thunder but refused to admit it and always found some task to do in another room when a storm was coming. She'd argued with Gideon about the kitchen window placement for 3 months and won, and she'd been right to win. Lenora listened to all of it and didn't feel diminished by any of it, which was the thing she'd been half afraid of. She understood. Now that she realized it wasn't happening, she'd worried that the more real Clara became, the less room there would be. But it worked the other way. The more real Clara became, the more she understood what she'd walked into and why it mattered, and the more deliberately she could choose to be part of it. You can't love people well if you don't know what they've already loved. That was what she'd learned in this house, in this kitchen, with these children and this man and a quilt made of 2 women stitching. Love isn't a replacement mechanism. It doesn't overwrite. It adds. Frances Poole, the woman from the church meeting, turned out to live up to her brief introduction. She appeared at the ranch in May with a jar of preserved blackberries and no particular reason given, and she and Lenora sat on the porch for an hour and talked about the garden and the creek and the difficulty of keeping chickens through a frontier winter. She came back the following week and the week after, and by June she was simply a presence, not a visitor, not a project, just a neighbor in the real sense of the word, someone you knew and could rely on and didn't need to perform for. Vera came too, with more regularity and more ease than before. She and Lenora arrived at a relationship that wasn't sisterhood, and wasn't exactly friendship, but was something functional and real. 2 women who had circled each other with suspicion and arrived, through crisis and honesty, at something better. Vera brought the children things sometimes, books, small sweets, once a length of fabric she said Clara had ordered and never collected from the dry goods store. She gave it to Maeve, who held it for a moment, and then gave it to Lenora for the summer curtains, which were cut and sewn and hung in the kitchen where the morning light came through them. The town shifted, not overnight, not completely. Harrow County was always going to be Harrow County, and Mrs. Aldous was always going to be Mrs. Aldous. And there were people who would calculate and judge and find their conclusions more comfortable than the truth. But the edge came off. The dry goods women said good morning when Lenora came in. The feed merchant's boy looked at her directly. Small things, but Lenora had learned from this household that small things are what most of life is actually made of, and underestimating them is how people miss what's important. She wrote to her mother in June and told her that she was going to be married in the fall to a rancher named Gideon Blackthorne, a man who had trouble with words but none with actions. She described the children, Eli making bread with more confidence now, still lopsided, nobody cared, Maeve doing Latin at the kitchen table with the ferocity of someone determined to master every hard thing put in front of her. Nora, who had started talking the way she'd apparently talked before, unstoppably, with opinions about everything and no hesitation in sharing them. She described the kitchen, the herbs on the beams, the pine table with its 8 years of scratches that would have 10 years' worth now and more to come. The window above the sink positioned for morning light. She didn't have to say, "I have found what I came for," and more than that. Her mother would read it in how she wrote, the same way she'd read it in the January letter. Her mother was good at that, at reading the things her daughter didn't say directly. It was, Lenora thought, possibly the thing she'd inherited that she'd been least aware of inheriting. The wedding was on a Saturday in late October, the anniversary of nothing in particular. They'd chosen the date simply because the harvest was in and the weather was still holding, and Gideon had said, "What about next Saturday?" with the same tone he used for everything, and Lenora had said yes with the same tone she used when she meant it absolutely. It was small. That was right. The church hall, not full. Neighbors, Vera and her husband, the Greers, who came with something like genuine warmth, Frances Poole, who stood in the back and nodded at Lenora when she came in as though confirming something she'd known. Maeve stood next to Lenora with the quilt over her arm because she'd asked if she could carry it, and nobody had been able to explain why not. Eli was beside his father, in a collar that was slightly too stiff and which he was bearing with visible fortitude. Nora had made herself a crown of dried wildflowers that morning with terrible structural integrity, and it was listing badly to the left by the time the ceremony started, and nobody fixed it because she was so pleased with it. It was not a perfect ceremony. The Reverend lost his place twice. Eli dropped something at a quiet moment, and the sound echoed. Nora's flower crown finally surrendered to gravity and fell off halfway through, which made her laugh out loud, a sudden bright sound in the middle of the solemn. And Gideon looked down at her, and his face did the thing that was more than a smile, and Lenora thought, there, that is what all of it was for. She looked at him when they said the words. His creekwater eyes, serious and steady and present in the way he was always present when he'd decided something. He'd decided this. He was not the kind of man who decided things lightly, and he was not the kind of man who said things he didn't mean, and when he said "I do," it was with the simple finality of a man closing an account book on a settled figure. She said her own words and meant them, all of them, without reservation or qualification. There was no part of her standing at a careful distance from this. She had chosen it with everything she had, and she knew the difference between that and all the times she'd chosen things because they were the only option. Knew it in her body, in the quality of the choosing, the way it sat in her chest without the particular weight of necessity. They rode home in the late afternoon, the 5 of them in the wagon. The children talked most of the way. Lenora sat beside Gideon on the bench and felt the ordinary solidity of him beside her, and watched the prairie open out on both sides of the road in its autumn colors. The grass gone golden, the sky that particular late October blue that has some depth to it, not the washed-out blue of afterstorms, but something more considered. The ranch came into view around the last bend. The main house, 2 stories of weathered timber, the wraparound porch, the stone chimney with its twice-repaired seam, the barn, the smokehouse, the chicken coop. The garden she'd turned herself in April, now cleared back for winter. The soil dark and ready. She looked at it and felt, without drama and without surprise, that she was looking at home. Not the home she'd been born into, not the home she'd survived, but the home she'd made, or been made by, because those things are rarely one-directional. You make a place, and a place makes you, and somewhere in the middle of that exchange, you stop calculating the debt and just live in it. Nora scrambled down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, flower crownless now, her dress dusty from the road. "Can we have cake?" she said. "There's cake inside," Lenora said. "I made it yesterday." Nora ran for the porch. Eli climbed down more carefully, pulling at his stiff collar, then giving up and pulling the whole thing off with a relief that was almost theatrical. He followed his sister at a dignified 9-year-old walk that became a run by the time he hit the porch steps. Maeve climbed down and held out the quilt to Lenora. "I thought you might want this back now," she said. Lenora looked at it. "It's Nora's." "I know, but Nora says you can have it when you need it." Maeve held it out another inch. "She said you stayed in the kitchen in the dark with her and you didn't make her go right back to bed. She said that's when she decided you were family." A pause. "I decided before that, but I didn't tell her." "When?" Lenora said. She took the quilt. "When you put the kitchen shelves back the way you'd had them," Maeve said, "after I changed them." The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. The expression she'd had for months and Lenore had begun to understand was as close as Maeve got to a grin. "I thought, someone who stays after that probably intends to stay." Lenora looked at her for a moment. Then she put her arm around the girl's shoulders, and Maeve let her. and they stood in the yard with the quilt between them and the house in front of them, and the late October light making everything gold. Gideon came around from tying off the horses and looked at them both. "Cake?" he said. "That was my contribution to the conversation," Lenora said. He went up the porch steps. Maeve followed. Lenora stood another moment in the yard, looking at the house, at the light in the kitchen window where Nora and Eli were already visible as moving shapes, already into the cake probably, already bickering about something. She folded the quilt over her arm. Clara's stitching and Maeve's and hers, all of it together, the old squares and the new, the parts you could tell apart and the parts you couldn't anymore. She went up the porch steps and through the front door and into the kitchen that had been designed by a woman she'd never met, who had loved this house and these children and this difficult, good man, and who lived in the herbs on the beams and the scratched pine table and the way the morning light came through the window above the sink. You can't replace what matters. You can only choose to honor it by taking care of what's still here. She hung her coat on the hook and rolled up her sleeves and got to work.